I would say that at least online and within the more sort of extreme tenets of the left, there does tend to be a sort of inverse racism, sort of
There is.
an openness to be very racist
Towards white people.
white people, for instance, or individuals who are perceived to have privilege because they have lighter skin. It's sort of like a serpent eating its tail eventually, because the world is becoming far more globalized than anything I think we can imagine. And soon, most of the people online are going to be from outside of the advanced Western economies, and are going to be creating their own communities and their own Twitter accounts and their own followings and their own YouTube channels with millions of followers. And I think when that happens, and I think it will probably happen very suddenly and very quickly, suddenly the internet is not going to be as, I think, lenient toward progressive values as it is now, at least in some spheres.
I didn't even think about that. How the demographics online will change and how the culture online will change as a result of that. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you because I have consumed a bit of your content, and I do really like your videos. And most recently, I watched your video, Kindly Do Better. And I thought it was a really good video. I agreed with it on a lot of parts. There are a couple of parts that I might not agree with as much. But I figured like we could kind of go over those things and like have a back and forth. And also your videos on like the dating market are also really good. I guess the first thing that I noticed, that one of the first points you made in your Kindly Do Better video was the micro issues versus macro issues, and how the online left is really good at focusing on micro issues, and as a result completely like skips over macro issues. And I agreed a lot with that. And one interesting point you brought up was transracialism, and how nobody really seems to have come up with a good argument against it, or has come up with has had a real conversation on it, I believe. I think that's something that I definitely agree with as well. And it's funny because I actually had a debate on transracialism maybe a year ago, and I tried to take the position that it wasn't like a valid kind of identity, I guess, is a position that I tried to take on it. And I think I ended up losing that argument, because you can't really make that argument without running into the same arguments that people use for transgender, to say that transgender isn't a valid identity or something like that.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that is, I think that's like a super, super valid point. And I'm not really sure how we would like tackle that, because I know in different cultures in the past, the way that we've looked at race has changed. Some people believe that they could change their race, but yeah, I think that we run into an issue by ignoring that entire argument, for sure. So the transracialism argument.
Yes, I'd agree. I think that it's I find it quite hypocritical and very difficult of, especially the left, to say that transgenderism is valid, but transracialism isn't, because you sort of fall into the same kind of arguments insofar as this idea of race being performative, which it well and truly is in essence, relative to gender, say, allegedly not being performative, because that's sort of what you fall into when you say that transracialism isn't a valid identity. I mean, I think it's quite obvious to distinguish between, say, Ollie London and Rachel Dolezal, for instance. Like, Ollie London is sort of a clout chasing
Yeah.
individual who's got a bit of an identity crisis and sort of found that in his idealization of K-pop, say.
Yeah.
And Rachel Dolezal sort of grew up and was very sort of socialized and just materialized in a very unique and exceptional way. And her life sort of very much mirrors that of somebody who really does identify as being African American.
She really doesn't.
And
Yeah, she identifies. It seems to me she truly, honestly identifies with that label, even if other people don't see her that way.
yeah,
And she identifies with it so much that she actually was doing activism as a result of how much she identified with it, which is more than what a lot of people can say about themselves. So
exactly. And it's
yeah.
quite interesting that a lot of sort of prominent trans racial individuals who've actually been exposed have been doing activism for their respective communities. Like, I forgot her name, but a well, she identifies as Native American academic, was doing
Mm-hmm.
academic work in the US
Mm-hmm.
for Native Americans. And a lot of individuals who end up being either academics or writers, it's very interesting just seeing sort of how immersed in that performative aspect of their transracial identity these individuals are sort of subsumed in. So
Yeah.
yeah, I personally I do think it is valid, and I
Yeah.
think that in saying that transracialism is valid, it is
Yeah.
synonymous to saying that I think that transgenderism is
Yeah.
valid,
Yeah.
because I do think that we need to have a bit more of an open discussion about this, particularly I would say on the left, who tend to be the ones who are most open
Yeah.
to such conversations, at least theoretically. And I
Yeah.
think in terms of moving it forward, it's important. So yeah.
Yeah. I guess for me, I'm still kind of pondering on the transracialism question, but I
Hmm.
think that there are a lot of valid arguments to it. And again, I completely lost the argument that I had like a year ago about it. So, but it, there is something to be said about even if you look at like the original use of transracialism as like somebody who was adopted into a different race of a family, um,
Hmm.
even that is kind of indicates like what that identity crisis could be, right? That
Hmm.
you grow up within one culture while looking like something else. You grow up and you experience and you appreciate and you learn and experience the history of a specific culture, but maybe you don't align with that culture in the way that you look. Does that mean that your experiences with this culture are invalid, or that you're any less of that culture? Probably not, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, yeah. I guess there was also another point that you made was laziness from the left. That you said the left dismisses other perspectives rather than hearing them out, which is something I super duper agree with. One of my friends, Short Fat Otaku, he did a video on fascism. And one of the things that he brought up is that when talking about fascism, a lot of academics refuse to use like fascist materials to actually define fascism, and they would just use their own academic material to talk about fascism. So instead of going
Mm.
to like straight to the horse's mouth, they would use everybody else's definition of what fascism is, except for the people who believed in fascism, which as a
Hmm.
result, people don't really seem like, now when people accuse people of fascism, people don't really know what it means, I guess. So I think that that was a really good point by you.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Oh, thank you. Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, sorry.
so I think then there was the next section, which was the rights advantage, and one of the advantages you brought up was honesty. And you
Hmm.
said the right is more honest than the left. So that the right is more honest about its racism, for example, while others
Hmm.
aren't.
Hmm.
And in some cases, I can agree with that. Um, and I agree with your assessment that, like, as a person of color, I would rather have people be honest about their racism to me than to not be honest about it. But I think there is, like, a communication, there's like a divide that happens there because, it implies that the left is just as racist, but not as forward about it, which I don't think you were trying to imply at all. I would say that, like, the left is racist. I don't think it's as racist as the right, and it may not be as honest, um, but I do want to separate and say that, like, it's probably not the same amount of racist as the right is, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah,
Yes, I wouldn't call it the same. I would
yeah,
say that at least online and within the more sort of extreme tenets of the left, there does tend to be a sort of inverse racism, sort of
there
a
is.
an openness to be very racist toward
Towards white
white
people.
people, for
Yeah,
instance, or individuals who are perceived to have privilege because they have lighter skin,
yeah,
even like colorism. I think that's
yeah,
far more an issue within the left, insofar as I think in some spheres, even sort of, I wouldn't actually not demonizing, but in a way, sort of kind of ridiculing maybe individuals who are
yeah,
lighter skinned, especially within the African American community, which I mean is
yeah,
it's pretty unfair, I think, just basically just for the individuals who are lighter skinned. It
yeah.
tends to be quite, I think, quite cruel and quite silencing, which is unfair. Um,
So yeah, I can agree with
yeah.
that. That there's a lot of, demonization of white people, I've noticed, or people are much more quick to make jokes about white people, or make jokes about how white people are all evil or all bad, when
Mm.
that would not be something that's acceptable if it were done to anybody else. So
Yes,
yeah.
yes, yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I do think that just sort of using the language of the left about sort of there being systemic racism, say, or systemic issues. I think that because they're systemic, everybody is inevitably sort of within the system and involved. So in a way, I think potentially racism is sort of something, if it's systemic, then it's something that affects and influences and is a part of all of us by that logic. So, I mean, I think it's a tricky road to be
Yeah.
on, I think, insofar as the left is concerned, with its idea of sort of racism and institutionalized racism, and sort of, I think, indirectly or just subconsciously, it seems to only apply to people who are either white or on the right.
Mm.
Um, but then when it doesn't apply to us exactly,
Yeah.
being on the left, say. So yeah, I think in saying honesty, I don't necessarily mean honesty and sort of honesty as a virtue, say. I mean just more sort of very literally, as in just saying it as it is, being upfront and forward about something, not necessarily associating good or positive connotations to it, but
Yeah.
just very practical, realistic ones. So,
Sure.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
I mean, also the left is definitely guilty of having misinformation, perpetuating misinformation, and I think, we don't really like to acknowledge how prominent that can happen on the how prominently that can happen on the left.
Hmm.
But it's
Hmm.
something that definitely happens. I'm trying
Hmm.
to think of other honesty areas, but I think you did have a really good point with that. Uh, Especially, like, for example, as somebody who comes from, like, uh, slightly more conservative, like, people in my like background tend to be more conservative with the way that they practice their lives, things like that. I come from a Muslim background, so when I bring that up, I think or bring up the realities of what that looks like, I feel in a lot of these spaces. I think a lot of leftists don't want to acknowledge that or don't want to believe things like that. Like, for example, that, you know, a lot of Muslims are not okay with like LGBTQ stuff in schools, things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that the left, I would say, when I say the left, I mean more so the sort of online left, which tends to be
Yeah.
very vocal and very loud. I think they tend to fall into caricaturing people. And if you
Yeah.
don't fall into that caricature of what they want you to be for the ideology,
Yeah.
then you're either just dismissed or ignored or
Yeah.
shamed or what have you, put into sort of a box,
Yeah.
which is not to say that the right online doesn't do the exact same thing. But
Yeah.
I think in terms of preaching a particular kind of ethics and a particular kind of understanding and nuance of people and lived experiences and being more aligned to, I think, sort of the virtues of liberalism and the idea of appreciating the individual and therefore their sort of freedom of identity and expression and being in the world. It seems very counteractive for the left to then fall into the same kind of rhetoric and I would say very easy and lazy argumentation and understanding of people as the right tends to, or the far more
Yeah.
extreme tenets of the right, especially online, fall
Yeah.
into.
Yeah.
And I think that's where they really lose so many people, especially increasingly so online.
I think
Yeah.
so too. I think, you know, you look at most communities, like minority communities, tend to be more moderate than
Mm.
the general liberal or left leaning kind of group as a whole, right? Like what white liberals tend to be more progressive than minority communities, and I think that's a reality that people have to acknowledge. So, for example, with like the when ACAB was a thing that was really big in America, that ended up performing pretty badly in communities, communities of color, actually, that whole sentiment within certain communities of color, because they ended up being more moderate on these issues than their white counterparts. So, yeah.
Okay. Yes. So what did you say that I'm so sorry. It's the static. I'm so sorry.
Oh, so it's okay.
Yeah.
Did you I was just talking about ACAB, like all cops are bad, when people
Yes.
were,
Okay. Yes.
repeating that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it actually ended up performing badly within certain marginalized communities, because those communities are actually more moderate than
Right.
some white liberal communities. So,
Yes.
so I think that we have like a messaging problem too, as well.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Yes. I think it's, messaging problem. And also, I think a lot of impatience as well, just with the state of the world, which is understandable, because I mean, the modern world isn't exactly a nice place.
Yeah.
And so I can understand the frustration and the impatience. But I think that with a lot of this, it's about having patience with people and sort of their lives and where they are in their lives and their journeys with their families and all of that. And just also patience with the fact that capitalism isn't going anywhere, at least not this century.
Yeah.
I would be very surprised. I mean, I think, very surprised. So I think that is something that the left does need to actually just accept. I mean, potentially neoliberalism is not very well liked by either the left or the right. The right despises neoliberalism just as much as the left, just in different ways and with different resolutions to being rid of it. But I don't think that means capitalism is going anywhere. And so I think the left needs to appreciate that they
Yeah.
need to work with and understand capitalism and be a bit more patient with people who are proponents of capitalism or people who have accepted it, as I
Yeah.
think most of our institutions through decades, if not centuries, of socialization into what we have today of modern or even postmodern capitalism um, have created and what we have now. So I think, yeah, I think that is more a problem of the left insofar as providing realistic and reasonable solutions and resolutions to things that is really lacking. Um, Marxist theory is great, and it's fascinating watching video essays about the exploitation of workers and the proletariat. But in terms of something actually substantial for people in the here and now, which really matters to people, I think there needs to be a greater understanding that vast majority of people in this world are poor and see capitalism or sort of the means provided by capitalism as a way out of poverty, as a way out of their struggle.
They do.
And they're not really thinking about the environment. They're not thinking about who's being exploited whilst they are at an advantage. So
One thing that I've brought up is I think majority of the world is poor, like you said, and sees capitalism as a way to, or the mechanisms of capitalism as a way to alleviate their poverty. But also, majority of the world I find is conservative leaning. I think. I think
definitely.
It's so strange to me when I bring that up to people who are left leaning and they don't believe it when I say that. And I think, but if you look, if you look at any, large population in the world, like people are not thinking about progressive values, really. They're just thinking about like their next meal. They're thinking about like making enough for their families and stuff like that. So.
Yes, yeah. And it's interesting to see the richer a society becomes, the more sort of, I would say, aware of progressive issues and concerns they become. I mean, just look at Iran today. In terms of looking at Iran just 30 years ago, we wouldn't be having the same kind of conversations about women like we are now. And I mean, sort of I was reading an article recently about sex toys, the sex toy market in the Middle East, especially the wealthier countries in the Middle East. And you can sort of see the wealthier societies become, the wealthier people become, then the sort of the progressive values or the values of more sort of individual self-awareness and individualization come into the picture. And I think it is just an example of just an appreciation that all societies sort of go through these stages and that you can't really just skip stages in order to get to one point. I mean, I think with the climate, for instance, there's this fabricated idea that somehow the developing world is going to just skip sort of very key aspects of industrialization and the modern market economy and suddenly just go on to green energy. And it's not really that, well, it's not at all
They're not
that
there
simple,
yet.
and it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's it's sad, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was something that's super interesting to me. And there's something that nothing really indicates to me that like people online are out of touch with reality more than when they can't even acknowledge these basic things about the average person in the world, the average, and what they're thinking about, and what is feasible for people in developing parts of the world. It just seems like a lot of people in the West who are very left leaning aren't able to acknowledge those points of growth that you can't skip. So.
Yes. Oh, yes, exactly. And I think it's just going to, it's sort of like a serpent eating its tail
Yeah.
eventually, because the world is becoming far more globalized than anything think we can imagine. And soon, most of the people online are going to be from outside of the advanced Western economies
Yeah.
and are going to be creating their own communities and their own Twitter accounts and their own followings and their own YouTube channels with millions of followers. And I think when that happens, and I think it will probably happen very suddenly and very quickly, suddenly the internet is not going to be as, I think, lenient toward progressive values as
Mhm.
it is now, at least in some spheres. I think at the moment there's definitely sort of a monopoly on, for instance, YouTube, very American based, American audience, money, etc. But I don't think that's going to be the case for a long time, especially with young population growth
Mhm.
in the rest of the world outside
Yeah.
of the West and Japan,
Yeah.
and a very tech savvy populace as
Yeah.
well. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm a perfect example of how I would
Yeah.
be absolutely slaughtered by any opposition. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think the internet is going to change insofar as its lenience toward these progressive
Yeah.
values if they stay as dead set in their idea of reality and their idea of people and their idea of people who are not um, from the sort of bubble that is the modern Western world. So
Yeah.
it will,
It's a really good
I
point.
mean,
I
from
didn't
my
even.
perspective, it'll be interesting, but we'll
Yeah,
see.
I didn't even think about that. That the how the demographics online will change and how the culture online will change as a result of that. I know in India, like every person has like a cell phone. Every person and their grandmother has a cell phone, and they
Mm.
give out their phone numbers like there's no tomorrow, and everybody's online. And while they haven't reached the same cultural significance as the West has. It's only a matter of time until there's enough people in developing countries online to create a cultural influence online. So,
Oh, exactly,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, definitely, definitely.
yeah,
I think it'll happen very suddenly and people will be quite shocked.
yeah,
But yeah, it'll be interesting to see. But I think uh, at this point in time, I do not think that the online left is prepared for that or willing to acknowledge that that is a real possibility.
hmm
And yeah, the rest of the world is definitely not as progressive
hmm
as uh, the modern Western world.
yeah,
So
yeah,
we will see.
yeah. You made a really good point about how the left is clicky. And I do think the online left is very clicky. I agree with you on that. But I think also the online right can be equally clicky. I think it's just not as evident
Mm.
because we kind of push them off of platforms so we don't get to see it as much. But if you look at like the far right online, they are very, very clicky. They have little factions and they're all fighting with each other. And we just don't get to see all of that drama because they're doing it on different platforms that we're not on. So, um, uh, yeah, the spotlight is on people who are on the online left. It's not on the online right as much. So,
Yes, yes. I do agree. I definitely agree with that. I do think that the right is just as cliquey. They've got their
yeah,
cliques. But
yeah,
I think it's interesting to see what the cliques are talking about or what the
mm,
infighting is about. Like sort of, for instance, the recent big drama on the right was with the Daily Wire and Steve
yeah,
Carter and
mm,
the contract. And in terms of what that's about, the idea of it, at least according to Steve, it was not about the the money per se, but about the idea of the the right or the idea of conservatism and moving forward, and not having big tech censoring creators and the message, and sort of doing this greater thing. It was all very ideological and all very visionary and sort of very on point with everything that Stephen Crowder stands for. And so I think there seems to be, in terms of the kind of drama that I see on the left, it doesn't seem to be so much about, I guess, the greater good of the movement, say. It's more so about squabbles between individuals of who's called somebody a transphobe, or who's called somebody sort of a fascist or a white supremacist, and exposing DMs about that. So I think, I think it's different kinds of drama. And I think the right also has a lot more, at least the prominent sort of alt-right, right, sort of has a lot of money and a lot of influence and a very loyal audience. And so when there is drama, it doesn't really rock the foundations of the Daily Wire and sort of the clique that they have. I mean, none of them are necessarily going to lose anything from what's happened. And I mean, even when they deplatformed, like Sydney Watson was deplatformed off Patreon, it didn't really affect the message or the prominence of Sydney Watson. So, yeah, I don't know. I do think that they're just as cliquey, but I think the objectives and the optics of it is very different.
Certainly, yeah. I think I think part of the reason why we see some of the crazier, more petty drama on the left is because the equivalent, the right wing creators that are equivalent in size of those left wing creators are not on the same platform. So while we see people like Steven Crowder and Ben Shapiro, they're content creators of much larger sizes than people like Shoe on Head or Xander Hall. But the equivalent of what Shoe on Head and Xander Hall are, that would be on the right, I think have similar petty beefs with each other, petty dramas with each other. But it's just not as visible. And I think it should be more visible because everybody online is goofy. I feel like if the left is goofy, so is the right. And I think I think like we need to like have more of a spotlight on people just being goofy online. People who like make the right out to be this big boogie monster, I don't think are really helping political discourse per se. So, yeah.
Yeah, yes. And I think that's also why I say that the right also tends to have it a lot easier in terms of just, I mean, just historically, but also now, just online. I mean, there isn't really an equivalent, I mean, an opposite to libs of TikTok, say.
Yeah.
And I mean, that Twitter account and others just like it do incredibly well, like just the numbers and engagement and everything. I mean, it's in terms of the message being put out, I mean, it's very, very persuasive and appealing to an audience or somebody who may be a bit put off by sort of the left because of what they see on libs of TikTok. So, yeah, I don't really see the same kind of, I guess, momentum on the left in that regard. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I wish that there were more things like libs of TikTok that that the left did as well. Because I think I think we should be calling each other out on these things, but there isn't any equivalent on the left. There's nobody shining a spotlight on how goofy some people on the right can be, and that ends up hurting people in the long run because you take one side super seriously and the other side you see, you know, crazy TikTok videos of. So, so it ends up hurting the discourse for sure. You brought up that racism against white people is seen as acceptable in some left spaces, and I agree with you on that. I think it's super cringe that people do that. But also, point about abstract people, I think, was really good. You brought up that the left is obsessed with abstract people, with people who, like these hyper minorities who don't really make up a good portion of the population. And I think that it, kind of goes back to my point about how most of the world is not thinking about progressive values and doesn't really care about the rights of marginalized people. They care about how they can advance themselves and how they can lift themselves out of poverty.
Yeah, exactly. I think with some things that I said in my video, sort of a lot of normative values were just placed on them. Like when I said that something was a micro issue, that was then misconstrued as me saying that that is an insignificant issue, which
Yeah,
is
which
not
is
what I
not
was
what you're
saying at
saying.
all.
Yeah.
I was just, I was saying, I watched a video by a leftist streamer who said the exact same thing that I said about sort of trans people making up a very small minority of the global population. And that was fine. But when I said it, it was sort of equivalent to being a transphobe on Turf Island. So I think that when it comes to a lot of these conversations, especially on the left, it can be very emotional and a lot of projecting of one's own situation, of one's own trauma, of one's own lived experience onto things. And I think as a minority, I used to do that a lot. I now don't, because there's no point in doing that, because I may feel validated in the moment, but in the long term, it does nothing. And it's just sort of a perpetual cycle of really having to grapple with the fact that the majority of the world, of the population, even those who profess to care immensely on the left, don't actually care or don't actually have the means and the tools to care insofar as changing your situation for the better in the way that they profess to be able to, with all these sort of institutional factors and changes that they sort of have on their fingertips. So I think when talking about sort of abstract people, like you said, I think it is often sort of representing this abstract person. And I think it's because in today's politics, there really isn't a lot of power that individuals have relative to, I would say, finance predominantly. And I think in that, there is sort of the subconscious reckoning that individuals are very powerless, politically speaking, now in the modern age, ironically, and that there is sort of power, or at least a sense of power, in representing an abstract person and an abstract cause, or representing or being at the forefront of a micro issue, because that's far more solvable than the macro issues, than the issues of the masses and everyone. And that's very overwhelming. And I get it. It's sort of a catch-22 and it's a contradiction. But I think there's power in identifying and admitting to the contradiction and the difficulties, as opposed to ignoring it and pretending that everything can be solved via a micro issue, which is not the case. I think I didn't say this in my video, but I think sort of a lot of micro issues can actually be, in a way, resolved through micro issues. I mean, through, for instance, accessible housing, say, and the housing market, and just inequality in terms of income with regards to mortgages, rent, etc. Everything sort of flows into just housing. And sort of, if you think about that just psychologically, the psychological value of having a home, having a private, actual, literal safe space to retreat to from the world. I mean, imagine if every trans person had a home, a safe space where they could, live and be autonomous. I mean, in terms of the intimate partner violence, in terms of societal alienation. I mean, a lot of that could trickle down in the way of actually aiding a lot of
Hmm.
people, a lot of minorities. I've definitely found that in my own life in terms of having that autonomy over my own life and own situation, that it's really helped me in terms of actually being free. And I
Hmm.
think that is what the left wants for everybody. And I couldn't agree more. But I think that there's other methods of getting about and
Yeah.
getting to those ends. There isn't
Yeah.
just this sort of one path, which I think the left is very intent on, which does and is proving to alienate and ostracize a lot of
Yes.
people who would otherwise be on the side of the left and be in favor of a lot of what the left stands
Yeah.
for,
Yeah.
including myself. I mean, I
Yeah.
think in terms of my politics, well, I'm not political, I'm not actively political, but in terms of sort of things that I read about, engage in, insofar as reading and having opinions on, I get where the left is coming from. Like, I definitely am not anti-left,
Hmm.
but in terms of what they're doing and how they're projecting themselves and are going about achieving the ends for, especially I would say, the most vulnerable people in society, like trans people,
Hmm.
I don't think they are in the long term doing a service to anybody, least of all, say, trans people.
Yeah, I feel as somebody, I'm like left leaning myself, and I feel like I've been alienated just for bringing up some of these points that you've brought up yourself, especially with like the um, the hyper minority kind of being focused on, and the average person, the average, like what the average person thinks, not really being talked about. There's also, again, most of the world does not have the means to even be able to have conversations about
Mm.
progressive values. They're too busy worrying about poverty and worrying about their families.
Yeah.
And so I definitely empathize with that a lot. And as somebody who also, I really like to talk to right wingers a lot, and I like to talk to really far right wingers as well.
Mm.
There's this kind of thought in the leftist kind of space that if you're not constantly making the world a more left place, that you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. So if you're doing an action, if you're creating content, if your content is not leading to the world becoming more left wing, then that content shouldn't be done, and it's wrong to do, which I just disagree with. Um, uh, I think that there's like value in having honest and open conversations with people from a wide variety of political viewpoints, especially
Mm.
given that we know most of the world, again, is not thinking about progressive values. So,
Yes, exactly, exactly.
yeah,
And just basically in terms of improving on one's arguments, one's position, just
yeah,
understanding the nuance of the world. I mean, talking to each other is the most important thing,
hmm,
especially to people who you don't agree with or you don't see reality in the same way as. So, yeah,
yeah,
I definitely see a lot of value in that.
yeah,
And I think the left would be uh, a lot further along down the road, if it, at least the online left, valued that a lot more, especially with the size of a lot of their platforms. Like a lot of them have
hmm,
well over like 300,000 subscribers on their YouTube channels,
hmm,
um, big followings on Twitter. I think in terms of actually engaging with other
hmm,
people, not just as sort of like a blood sport, but like actually having conversations and talking and getting to understand.
hmm,
I think that could go a long way in terms of, I think, especially just humanizing the
hmm,
left, because I think right now the left has been quite successfully caricatured on the likes
yes,
of TikTok,
yeah,
for instance. And I think that definitely is not to the left's advantage, because I would say the vast majority of people on the left are, you know, okay people.
yeah,
But in terms of the loudest voices who are like just out there, just sort of defining the narrative and the direction of things, they are caricatures, and I think that really does a disservice to the left
Mm,
and what it wants.
mm. Okay. What did you think? I don't know if you've been paying attention to social media a whole lot, but have you seen all of the controversy around Mr. Beast and his new YouTube video?
Yes,
What did you think
yes,
of
I did.
that?
Jay. Yes, I actually put out a tweet about that this afternoon. Um, yes, I think this is an example of what I said about what the majority of people care about and what a very small, very vocal, primarily leftist minority care
Mm-hmm.
about, sort of the systemic issues
Yeah.
of Mr. Beast and philanthropy and charity. And, that's all well and good. Like you can have that conversation. But in terms of what somebody now who is actually blind, and, healthcare is trash, its healthcare system is in shambles. But in terms of actual, meaningful, in the here and now, uh, things that are happening, if Mr. Beast is going to be the individual who's going to give your child, your wife, your husband, your grandmother sight, then by all means, it's a brilliant thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it is what it is. I feel that the the likes of Mr. Beast and people, they can't make anybody happy,
Yeah.
especially not on the left. But yeah, yeah, I did put out a tweet in a sense, just
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, about it.
Yeah.
But what were your thoughts?
I felt really bad for Mr. Beast.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, he went out of his way to not only cure 1,000 people of blindness, he did it not only within like the West, right? Because most people who do these types of acts of charity do them where they're located. He went and he did it
Hmm.
across multiple countries, which is like
Hmm.
more than you can say about most people who do this. And
Yeah.
that in itself, we should be able to acknowledge that sure, we can have better systems of healthcare across the globe, but there are still going to be some medical technologies and procedures that we aren't able to make available for a low enough cost that it's readily available for most people in the world.
Hmm.
And while we should strive for that, um, while we should strive for that, universal healthcare isn't necessarily going to be the fix all for that, especially if we don't have enough equipment, if we don't have enough labor. There's a labor shortage within healthcare right now as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Uh, I think it's very easy to have answers to
yeah,
big questions without actually considering the particular nuances of the question. It's very easy
yeah,
to sort of just, say like, we can fix healthcare. I mean, what does that even mean?
yeah,
I mean, what does it even mean to like, I see a lot on Twitter, especially with this Mr. Beast thing, that there'd be no Mr. Beast if there wasn't capitalism. Um, there'd be no Mr. Beast if there wasn't capital. Yeah. And I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, it just it's it's such a outlandish, just
yeah,
it's a claim that's just not even based in any kind of reality, I feel, because it doesn't it's really just this idea that there's easy answers to these things.
yeah,
And I think it's very indicative of, I would say, quite a privileged position to be in, at least politically, which I think progressivism and progressive politics is a very privileged politics relative to the rest of global politics. You're able to think about yourself, you're able to use your critical faculties freely,
mm-hmm.
and so you can say things as uh, dim as sort of, if we abolish capitalism, this wouldn't even be an issue.
Yeah,
And it's really not the case at
yeah,
all. So I think, a lot of the world's issues, if not all of them, politically speaking and socially speaking, are just
mm-hmm.
very difficult and will take
Mm-hmm.
years, decades to in any way evolve and change and progress forward, um, or even just change. So yeah.
Yeah. Somebody in chat asked the question: does generalizing about the other side hurt both sides? And what your opinion is on that?
Yes, I think it does. I think it's inevitable though. And I think
Mm,
the way to counter that is to talk to the other side, because
mm,
then you're forced to have your generalizations challenged. You're forced to humanize somebody who's representing the other side. And I think that helps in nuance and in also undermining the negative aspects of generalizing. I think we inevitably generalize just in order to understand the complexities of the world and of people. I
mm,
mean, it's impossible not to. Um, but I think the way that we challenge that and acknowledge that is by actually talking to people honestly, without sort
mm.
of this objective of putting them down or
Yeah.
winning a debate, but more so in trying to actually humanize each other. I think
Yeah.
that's the important part. I do think that's lacking a lot now, especially with sort of the anarchy of Twitter sort of
Yeah.
infiltrating every
Yeah.
sphere of the virtual world. But yeah, I think generalizing's inevitable, but there's ways to counteract the negative aspects of that. So yeah.
Yeah. Um, what do you think is the most ridiculous or bad faith interpretation of your video?
Um, hmm.
I tried to watch FD Signifier uh,
Oh
and
yes.
his friends talk about it. I could not follow along. It was like it was so incoherent trying to follow along with that.
Oh, thank you. That
Yeah.
means a lot. You're one in a few. Um, yes. Oh, the most bad faith. Oh, oh, there's so many. But I think mainly this idea that I'm a transphobe or
Mm,
yeah, that I'm a transphobe uh and racist or internally racist. I think that was probably the most
mm,
bad faith take. Um, and then I found when I tried to defend myself, that was not seemingly allowed. It was just, I mustn't say anything. I must just let it be. The idea that um, because somebody on, I believe their name's Bellamy on the panel of FD's video
mm,
said that they're trans, and therefore, if a trans person says to me that I'm transphobic, then I must accept that. That was just
yeah.
that blew me away.
Yeah.
So yeah, I I think that just generally, when people sort of project their reality and their idea of reality and how I should see the world based on their reality through their eyeballs, and that if I don't, there's something wrong with me, even though I've never lived their reality, I don't live in their reality, I don't see the world through their eyeballs, inevitably, that's somehow a fault or a flaw of mine,
Mm,
and that somehow reading books or watching videos of progressive YouTubers is going to counteract my lived history and experiences and who I am. I've been socialized as this individual that I am for 25 years. It's ridiculous. So
yeah.
yeah, I think that sort of, for me at least, was just sort of the essence of the bad faith of it all. I
Mm,
think that just everybody thinks that their reality is the reality of
mm,
everyone. And that's not the case. And I think sort of the response and the responses that I got to that video um, really proved that point more and
yeah.
more so to me. even though I thought at the time, I thought it was a good idea for me to make this video because I thought, well, I'm not on the right, so
Mhm.
it isn't going to be seen as somebody from the right just sort of bashing the left. But
Mhm.
because I'm very neutral, because I identify as apolitical, I don't I don't care to be politically engaged or involved at this present time. And, it's a very privileged position to be in, but
Mhm.
it is the position that I find myself in. So there you go. Um, I thought that coming at it from that perspective of just sort of analyzing the landscape, not necessarily saying that the right is right, but that, the left and the right have different things going for them and not going for them. And it's interesting to see that, and that the left can do better just based on my sort of attempt to be as objectively analytical about it as possible. I think that general sort of perspective, sort of my reality, which is very much my reality, not one projected onto others. I'm the apolitical one, I'm the analytical one, I'm the sort of transracial,
Mhm.
bi South African, sitting in her room in England. That's very much a me thing. I thought that that would be respected a bit
Mhm.
more than it was. But instead,
Yeah.
sort of my reality was just ignored.
Yeah.
And
I'm
these
sorry.
labels and these
Yeah.
characteristics were just placed on me.
Yeah. I'm so sorry about that. I know that there were like even at the most extreme I saw like Candace Owens comparisons, which were like
Oh,
so out of
yes.
like so strange to me. Like like I didn't pick up any Candace anything remotely close to Candace Owens from you, but like we could make the argument that that's like in a way like a little bit of like maybe there's like some racial undertones there. So
Oh
yeah,
yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, definitely,
yeah.
definitely. I mean, the things that people say. I mean, I'll still look like Candace Owens even if I agree with you. So, you know,
I don't think I think you look much prettier than Candace Owens. So yeah,
oh,
uh,
thanks.
yeah,
Yes. But yeah, yeah, I think so. I think definitely a lot of racial undertones to
yeah.
that claim, but oh well.
Yeah. Somebody wanted to ask, do you think the pendulum will swing back the other way, or do you think the rhetoric will continue to become more extreme um, uh, in reference to like the right and the left not understanding each other? And is there a solution to that?
Oh, interesting question. I think yes, I don't think the polarization is going anywhere. I think that I'm actually making a video on this, that I do think that now, especially based on just in January, sort of what is, or like from, I'd say the end of 2022 until now, sort of an anti-woke sentiment and movement that seems to
Mm-hmm.
be
Mm-hmm.
starting.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say it's a coherent movement, but in terms of, I mean, I counted these three Twitter accounts that sort of emerged in September last year and now have about 1 million followers each, and they just document um, sort of wokeness
Mm-hmm.
very pejoratively and negatively. And so I think that there's definitely an audience now that is moving toward a sort of anti-woke sentiment. And I think also with the trigonometry comedian Konstantin Kissin's viral video at the Oxford Union, sort of tackling woke,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's definitely swinging in that direction more and more so, sort of that more vocal and overt anti-wokeness. And I think because moderates and people who are in the center in our modern world, um, who I would say formulate the majority of people, are sort of being ostracized by the left and
Mm-hmm.
by the woke narrative, that
Mm-hmm.
they are going to find sort of more in common and more allegiance with the right and with the anti-woke movement.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, Uh,
Yeah.
I do think I do think things are going to get more polarized, but in the long term, I I don't know. I'm not
Mm.
exactly sure. I mean, I do sort of predict that there's going to be a resurgence of Christianity in the modern Western world because I do think that the promises of enlightenment and enlightenment science has not given people the kind of meaning and purpose that religion has and
Mm.
does give to vast swathes of people across the world. I mean, in terms of
Mm.
social homogeneity and family values and a sense of purpose, I think
Mm.
that's really missing in the West relative to a lot of other parts of the world, where that tends to be sort of front and center for a lot of people. So I do think that um, the church and Christianity, particularly, is going to make a bit of a comeback, not just religiously, but sort of institutionally.
Mm.
I think in the UK, we're already starting to see, especially the Mormon church is gaining a lot
Really?
of momentum insofar as land.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think later on this century, I think
I didn't know
people
that
are
there
going
was
to,
a.
uh,
I didn't know that
sorry.
there was a a Mormon presence in the UK. Is there like a significant population in the UK?
No, it's actually the population very, very small.
Uh
They
huh.
hardly gain any members. I think only about 60 to
Yeah.
100 members last year.
Hmm.
But in terms of buying up of land, especially where I live,
Hmm.
the Mormons own so much land. It's
Wow.
incredible. And very, very wealthy, lots of donors. And I think also in terms of their message of hope, um, and I think in terms of their wealth, which I think inevitably people are going to be attracted to,
Mm.
if the Mormon church can promise you, I don't know, a subsidy on your rent,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's going to draw lots of people in. And I think that is definitely going to be a factor, as I think politics fails more and more people as it is now. I mean,
Mm.
people don't really trust politicians at all or have a
Yeah.
lot of faith in institutions. Um, but they're very strong. And it sort of
Yeah.
isn't, as I said, going anywhere.
Yeah.
And I don't think capitalism generically is going anywhere. So people need something to believe in, I
Mm.
think. And I think this experiment of believing in nothingness, or believing in, I guess, the market has not proved terribly persuasive or terribly meaningful to most people. So
Mm.
I think
Hmm.
God may be the answer at some point, but we'll see.
I mean, there's definitely something to be said about communities and how churches created communities for a lot of people. But
Hmm.
um, I I still think that there are ways that new communities that are like non-religious communities can pop up. Like we see online communities becoming really big and
Yeah.
being something that a lot of people will unite over. And I wonder if we'll see some like more resurgence of that as well. Um,
Hmm.
I do definitely acknowledge what you're saying about people's faith in institutions. There's a lot of people who are losing faith in institutions. Um,
Hmm.
I'm hoping that that can change because I do think that different institutions have varying levels of competency, and some of them I think get a bad rap. So
Yeah.
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 Um,
I, sorry.
no,
Yeah.
no, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was just going to say, just to add on to that, I think the important difference is that I think we haven't inevitably, like all humans throughout history, we don't deal with the acceptance that we are mortal and that we're going to die. I mean, even now we're trying to just counter that with plastic surgery and
Mm-hmm.
cosmetic procedures and stuffing our old people into old age homes.
Mm-hmm.
We really do not want to acknowledge um, dying. And I think what religion provides and what a religious community provides is an answer to what happens after, that there is something after, that there's sort of this otherworldly prospect, that there's something bigger than you and something that you have to have faith and hope in. It sort of prepares you for the inevitable and for death, and you have to confront that with your family and your community.
Mm.
And I think the thing with online communities and also just with atheism and enlightenment science is that effectively it either doesn't talk about these things, these real human fears that are sort of at the root and core of all of
Mm.
us, or it just tells you that, when you die, you become nothingness and you just are in the ground or cremated, and that's all. There's nothing else to really believe in. And
Yeah.
so it's quite frightening as you get older. And I think online communities really don't have that sort of overarching figure or
Mm.
representation of something otherworldly, something bigger than the community, which is why I think they're so fickle, why their memberships just come and go. I mean, I think we can see with just YouTube as well, people just come and go, your subscribers come and go.
Mm.
It's not sort of a community based on sort of shared traditions and symbols and a shared perspective of where we're inevitably going as a community towards, something bigger and greater. Like, I don't know, Susan as a god who's going to save us all. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I think there's something lacking, and there's something not as tangible in our communities now that sort of religious communities really do have,
Mm.
which I think they'll really be able to capitalize on um, going into this century, I would say.
Hmm. Okay. One person wanted me to ask you, do you have any thoughts on the harms the U.S. progressive white agenda has on Black people when they co-opt for example, the term woke of African American English vernacular and culture for the sake of movements and commodities? It's a long question. I can copy paste that to
The
you if you want.
sort of
So,
the etymology of woke, I believe it emerged from firstly sort of the US labor movement,
mm,
and then was brought into African American vernacular,
mm,
and then sort of now is used by progressives,
mm,
white progressives, I guess. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's just the flow of language. Inevitably, people co-opt everything. They
mm,
claim everything. It's what happens. Cultural appropriation, all these things. It happens. Um, and I think the best way to counter it probably is to just try and co-opt it for
yeah.
yourself again, which will take a while. Um, but yes, I'm not sure exactly what the question was. Was it just what do I think about that?
Yeah, essentially, like what your thoughts are on U.S. progressive white communities, and whether they harm like Black communities and other communities when they co-op the vernacular from more marginalized communities. So,
Um, Whether they harm. Mm, maybe unintentionally.
hmm,
I don't think the actual intention is to cause harm.
yeah,
I think that's just an after effect.
yeah. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
like, other than maybe being insensitive, I'm not really sure what the harm would be of co-opting different terms from different communities. I think that's just like how culture sharing works, essentially. like
Yeah,
multiculturalism. Yeah.
yes. And I think now as our cultures become more interconnected and interdependent, I think that's just inevitably going to happen now. And I think, I mean, there's a lot of power in language and who wields the power of language. But I think that with the internet now, uh, there's far more means to sort of spread the power and the
Yeah.
influence to different communities through different networks.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
yes, I wouldn't say that sort of the pejorative um, connotations of woke now are simply just a white progressive thing.
Hmm.
I think that this is sort of I don't think it's just about the color of one's skin. Um, that sort of the pejorative connotations have been associated with them. I mean,
Hmm.
on Twitter, I mean, I've seen Black people say the most bizarre things about
Yeah.
sort of, it's about
Yeah.
white people, just sort of
There
matter of
was
factly, like, oh, yeah, we should just kill
there was
white
that
people because,
TikTok.
why not?
Yeah, there was that TikTok of that girl saying that if you have white friends and you bring them to hang out with other
Oh,
people,
yes,
yeah, that
the
you
white
should,
shenanigans.
yeah, that maybe maybe I'm not in the mood for that today, and maybe you want to ask us
Yes.
before if we want to hang out with them. Like, I think this is segregation. I think we
Oh,
did this before. I think this has happened. Um,
I know. I mean, it's brilliant.
it's like it's comedic genius, honestly. Like
It is. I
yeah,
couldn't believe it was real. I had to actually
yeah,
watch all of their TikToks because I just could not believe it was real. But it's real. But
yeah,
I'm hoping that in 10 years or so, they look back and they think, wow, I had a moment, I mean,
yeah.
all of us, we all have
Yeah,
our
no, I mean,
stupid moments as
I definitely went through like
oh,
my ultra feminist stage. I mean, I'm still a feminist, but I there was
mm.
when you're first getting into like politics and ideology when you're young, it's super easy to go off the deep end. And I think
Oh yeah.
I definitely had a phase with the feminism where it was like, yeah, men are, all men are evil and all of that. Now I only do that like as a joke, but yeah,
Yes.
uh,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at one point in my life, I thought that people who wore makeup were responsible for the deaths of Africans in the Congo.
yeah,
It's
yeah. Wow,
yeah. So
yeah,
yeah.
um, yeah. So I guess have you kept up with the like weird deep fake porn stuff that's been going on with the streamers or?
Only insofar as what I've seen on Twitter,
Okay.
just scrolling, and
Yeah.
I've just seen. I don't know the names of everybody involved,
Yeah.
but in terms of I've seen a pretty prominent Twitch streamer crying on stream with his partner about being exposed for having tabs up of watching deep fake
Yeah.
content of friends of his who are Twitch streamers like
Yeah. Yeah.
Pokimane and
I
yeah,
know it's
yeah.
not really related to the politics, but I guess I was curious about what your views are on that whole situation.
Yeah, I think this makes me think about at the moment, Mr. Girl is going on this crusade and
Hmm.
venture of, I think, ethical porn or vegan porn consumption of
Hmm.
the future. This idea of using AI porn, and sort of is very much promoting that on his Twitter, at
Hmm.
least.
Hmm.
And, I think in theory, that sounds great. I think this is another thing, with not that Mr. Girl is a leftist, but just with a lot of leftists, this idea, things in theory sound great, but in reality, um, people are not, as human beings, we are really not that enlightened and are not that rational and are not that morally aware
Yeah.
through the days of our lives in everything that we do. And so I think it leads to things such as deep fake porn, such as
Yeah.
these things that are really not well regulated at all. That really, yeah, I mean, it's terrible, at least in terms of what this website, I
Hmm.
believe it's a website, I believe it's been taken down now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's no, I do not agree with it at all. I think it's
Yeah.
an example of just pure anarchy and humans really creating things that we really creating our own demise,
Yeah.
just sort of in a microcosmic way,
Yeah.
just in this sense. I think we've really created something that we have no control over and
Yeah.
really no regulation or any sort of moral education preceding the sort of emergence
Yeah.
of this, which I think is just going to result in more of this happening inevitably. And yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was interesting watching him there crying with his wife. Okay, so this is going to be completely unrelated, but I think his wife was crying out of anger more than anything else because if I know
Hmm.
if I had a partner who was looking who paid for deepfake porn of our friends, I would be really mad. I would be really mad with them. But yeah,
Hmm.
there's definitely a lot of consequences with how good deepfakes are becoming. There could be positives. Somebody brought up to me that now people who don't want to engage with sex work could create that type of content with ever having to do sex work, which is interesting. It's an interesting like positive that somebody could pull from that. But at the same time, like how much of our likeness do we own? I guess is the question.
Exactly. And I think it just feeds into this idea that I think for young people now, especially for instance, I'm not sure about the US, but in the UK at least, I mean, apparently most children by the age of 9 have watched porn or have seen
Yeah.
porn, and most girls who are like 14 and over think that violent sex, like pornographic sex, is normal sex.
Hmm.
I think all of this just feeds into how we're increasingly seeing our fantasies as being something that we are either entitled to or that should be realized in our real lives or that they should be prioritized. I think there's sort of this fixation on sort of fantasies and sort of individuals having, I guess, a right to those fantasies, which
Yeah.
I think is all well and good, but in sort of a very unregulated marketplace like the porn industry, I think that really turns into a lot of lucrative ventures and also really has the potential to ruin a lot of relationships.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's sort of self-sabotaging in the way of I think we all want relationships, meaningful, honest relationships with people that actually mean something.
Mm.
And that really cannot be based in any kind of fantasy of what those people are going to be in our lives.
Yeah.
And I think it's porn in general is just, it's a thing. But I do think that its overconsumption is just an example of sort of easy access to something that humans have never before in history had
Mm.
easy access to, unless you were like, I don't know, some king who had
Hmm.
access to like all the mistresses in the world. But that was just an exception. Whereas now it's sort of everybody can have access to anybody. And with deep fakes, you can have access to literally anyone. Like if
Yeah.
you wanted to have, yeah. So it's, I don't think it does us any good.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah, I think depending on the way that it's used, it could definitely be pretty bad for people. And I
mhm,
agree with you. You know that we have like an oversaturation of. It seems that in some ways we have an oversaturation of sexuality in our culture, and then in other ways
yeah,
we are very restrictive around the way that we talk about it,
yes.
which I think is a problem in itself. Um, so yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
a
it's interesting.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
like on the one hand, we're, like you said, just obsessed with sexuality. But then on the other hand, we're very puritanical about,
yeah,
sex and especially children. I mean, children are like this like sacred entity.
yeah,
And it's, there's like a pedo around every corner.
yeah,
So it's, yeah, I think we've got, I don't know, sort of the science of sexuality that we have. I sort of read quite a bit of Michel Foucault about this. It's just very, yeah, I think we know a lot more than we do. And then we turn that into like sort of a science and sort of knowledge and information and content as well. And I think we, in the process, sort of really sabotage sort of, I think
hmm
what a lot of sexuality is, which is very fluid, ever changing. I mean,
hmm
especially women's sexuality, I
yeah,
mean, changes over the years, over
yeah,
time. I mean, sort of, I was reading an article recently about sort of women uh, coming out as lesbians in later life, like in their
hmm
50s and 60s and all these things. So I think, I think, yeah, sexuality is really, we have so many labels for
hmm
things, so much knowledge about these things, but I don't think any of us actually fit
yeah,
perfectly or well into any of these labels. And I think you see things then like detransitioning, you
yeah.
see sort of relationships that are very, I think, unfulfilling, sort of emerging from this. So yeah, I think we have a very, very peculiar, very contradictory relationship to our own sexuality and to just our culture of sex as well,
Yeah.
which is
I think so too.
bizarre.
I think so too. I guess one last question from the audience. I don't want to keep you too long. I do appreciate you doing this interview with me. What role does consumerism play in these issues, you think? Around
Oh,
sexuality, around.
yes. Well, at the moment, I'm very against consumerism being a part of particular spheres of life. I
Mm-hmm.
think consumerism, I think markets are good in general. I think, at least theoretically, and I think that they can really be a means for good, especially, um, I'd say like quick fixes and quick solutions to things for people and giving people sort of autonomy. Um, but I think that there are some domains of life where consumerism should just not be
Yeah.
an aspect. I think, in terms of our love lives, I think when it comes to dating apps, and that sort of consumer market, I think
Mm.
that's just had very negative effects on the vast majority of people who are on them and who utilize them and use them in order to try and find meaningful connections with people. Um, and I think in education, it should not be a thing at all, especially in, I would say, higher education, especially. I think that's had very negative effects on higher education. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think we are just we're so used to consumerism that we now see everything as consumable and we see each other just as
Yeah.
consumers, and everything is sort of turned into a marketplace. I mean, even
Mm.
conversations with people is now sort of consumable content where you make money from, where you know, sell
Mm.
products, everything. And it is what it is, and it is the way that it is. But I do think that we need to have, I think, more critical conversations with ourselves about being consumers, because I think a lot of blame for the negatives of consumerism are just placed on uh, big corporations, on individuals who
Mm.
are dominating the market, on the Mr. Beasts of the world, rather than sort of looking at ourselves as consumers with
Mm-hmm.
responsibility,
Yeah.
with autonomy, in terms of our choices, in terms of whether we are going to consume things, whether we're going to go onto dating apps and pay for subscriptions,
Yeah.
even during a recession. So I think yeah, I think in theory, I think everything is great in theory, and I think consumerism is definitely an example of something that's really great in theory.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the counterweight of responsibility of a consumer is, I think it's lacking, at least lacking relative to what is needed. So yeah.
I definitely resonate a lot with what you've said, especially about the dating market. I'm somebody who, like, when I used to open up things like Tinder or dating apps, I would be completely overwhelmed by them immediately. And I know that for the opposite, for men, it was like a self-esteem drain for a lot of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's terrible for men. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
I didn't even realize how bad it was for men. And so I've been telling people lately when they ask me for advice to even try stepping away from dating apps, like just try going to clubs and things like that, because people can't filter you out the same way they do on dating apps. But yeah, definitely the consumerism within the dating pool, the dating marketplace has changed things, and I think for the worse. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it sort of, it reminds me of, I think, just porn. I think it's sort of like it tends to be like there needs to be some element of personal responsibility, I think. Like it's sort of like the easy way out. It's a lot easier to just get off in front of your computer than there's to actually go out and try and find a partner and, go through the rejection and everything. And I think it is a very human thing. We all seek the comfortable, the easy. But I think in terms of getting to where we want in life, in terms of relationships, in terms of our own self-worth, I think you have to really do those difficult things. And so, I think with dating apps as an example of that, sort of, it's difficult to get off them because it's sort of right there, like sort of this whole domain and app with just potential people. But I think in terms of actually just really having to have a meaningful conversation with somebody, having to actually go and join community ventures and groups and things, go to even gym classes, where you can talk to people and get to know them over a long period of time. I think that's far more rewarding in the long term and far more important just in terms of individual self-worth and growth as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I guess last question, and then I'll let you go because I don't want to keep you too long, and I really appreciate you doing this.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry for wasting all that time at the beginning.
Oh no, it's fine, and maybe we can follow up and do this again sometime.
I'd love to.
Yeah. So the name Kidology, where did that come from?
Right. Well, Kidology, it basically just means sort of I guess in English, like taking the mickey, like when something isn't like don't take yourself too seriously or something. That is a kidology. It's something that is a bit of a deceitful even. So yes, I thought, I don't know really. I think I just liked the word. I just read it in an article somewhere and just thought, oh wow, that's an interesting word, a kidology. I haven't heard of that before. So yes, it sort of refers to that. I know, at least since the FD signifier situation, people have been presuming that it's got something to do with kids, as it happens online. But no, it's it just basically means sort of the art of deception. Not that I'm trying to deceive, but I think, just not taking myself too seriously. Just everything is not always as it seems, I guess. I guess maybe I'm a bit deceptive. I sort of look the way I do, but I'm not exactly reminiscent of anything that I sort of appear externally. So I don't know exactly, but it's sort of just stuck.
Yeah, it's a good one. Well, thanks for joining me. Hopefully we can do this again with less tech issues and all of that. I'm sorry that we had all that. So, I'm sorry. I'm completely. I'm sorry, I'm so completely like useless in that category. All my chat was yelling at me to like Stardust help her. I'm
It's
like, I don't
fine.
know how to do that. Uh, yeah, so
Oh, it's fine.
yeah, but I
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you again, definitely.
yeah.
And like, I have lots of questions for you as
Oh,
well.
do
But
you?
yeah,
If you
so
have any questions, let me know. Yeah, because I'm
oh
always
yes,
happy
yes,
to.
yeah. Like I watch your content, so
Oh,
yeah, I've
for
got
real? Okay.
questions about sort of yes, yes, I
Yeah.
do. Yes.
Wow.
You know, I do. I do love your banana.
Oh,
That's
thank
great.
you. Yeah.
Um,
A lot of
and
people
your
hate that.
Putin stream was brilliant.
My
So
what
yes,
stream?
your sorry,
Which stream? I'm sorry. Which stream
your
was?
Vladimir Putin
Oh,
stream.
thank
Uh,
you. Yeah,
yeah,
really
that was
appreciate that. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes. But yes, yeah. It's getting quite late where I am. Well,
yeah,
morning
yeah, yeah.
basically. But
Oh, I'm so
yes, I'd
sorry
love to
for
talk
keeping you
again.
up. Yeah, yeah. I would love to
Yeah,
too. Well, we should we'll set up another time, and you can ask me all the questions that you have about
oh yes.
banana and Putin and anything else.
Oh
Yeah.
yes. Oh,
So
brilliant.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Thank you so much for having me
Thank you so
on. It was
much.
brilliant.
Yeah. Have a great day. Have a great night.
Yes.
I know it's 4
Thank
a.m.
you.
there. So
Yes.
yeah. See
Yes.
ya.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye. Bye.